Welcome to podcast episode 300. I'm Stuart McCullough. I'm the CEO of VHAA. Joining me for today's discussion is the Director of Workplace Relations, Tim Nagel. Welcome, Tim.
Thanks, Stuart. Great to be here on this very special occasion.
It is a very special occasion, which is why one of us has gone to some considerable effort to mark the occasion. But Tim, I can see that you haven't put your balloons up.
No, no.
Well, that is awkward. It is awkward when you're sort of expecting a joint celebration and it turns out to be a little more one-sided. Tim, we haven't done this for a while, but I thought because it was our 300th episode, we should get a bit nostalgic and we should start with a clue. And the first clue is an image. And I'm going to ask you just to describe what you see.
Is it Ross from Friends in a T-shirt?
It is Ross from Friends. He's wearing a T-shirt. Lots of people wear T-shirts. That's not so remarkable. But yes, it is Ross from Friends. Let's bring up a second image and let's see if you can describe that for those who are listening rather than watching.
It's a saucepan on the stove being stirred with a spoon.
All right. So we have a Ross from Friends and a pot being stirred. What would you say is the subject for today's discussion?
Clearly meal breaks.
Tim, you couldn't be more wrong. We're talking about Ross and rosters. Clause 45, we're continuing our implementation series of the amended 2024 Nurses and Midwives Agreement. And with the focus being on clause 45, usually at this point, Tim, we'd go to the first subclause, but in this instance, there's a note that precedes the first subclause. What does the note say?
So I'll bring it up on screen. It says this clause does not apply to casual employees, dons or deputy dons.
All right. So straight off the bat, we have an exclusion. Is it the only exclusion under the clause?
No, there's an additional exclusion at subclause 10, but we'll get to that shortly.
So subclause 10, just marking it out as a new subclause. And the fact that it contains some exclusions probably go some way to explaining subclause number 1.
It does. So subclause 1 provides as follows. 45.1, subject to clause 0, the ordinary hours of full-time and part-time employees we worked according to a written roster that will A, be of at least 28 days duration, B, be posted at least 28 days before it comes into operation in each work location, where it can easily be seen by employees and representatives of the employees, including the unions, without notice, and C, as far as practicable, reflect the roster each employee will work. It goes on to say nothing in this clause precludes an employer from also issuing the roster or the on-call roster in electronic form.
So lots of elements in that subclause. Firstly, it is, as we've been saying, continuously subject to clause 45.10.
Yeah, but it's also clear as to whom the obligation does apply, full-time and part-time employees.
And the roster is a written roster, although that doesn't preclude an electronic roster, but that electronic roster must have certain features.
Yeah, namely that's for at least 28 days and is posted at least 28 days before it starts. And then it can also needs to be readily seen by employees and representatives, including unions.
And I think that's probably the item that people need to consider in designing an electronic roster, that issue of access by representatives, including union officials.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
I suspect we'll be discussing the as far as practicable phrase shortly, but it does take us on, Tim, to the second subclause.
That's on screen now and consists of 5 elements. So 45.2, rosters will A, set out the employee's daily ordinary working hours, starting and finishing times, and meal intervals. B, have a staffing and skill mix that complies with the Safe Patient Care Act, if applicable to that ward or unit. C, allocate a registered nurse, registered midwife to be in charge of each shift. D, not change without at least 14 days notice of a change in roster other than in an emergency situation external to the employer, subject to the below provision. Provide an employee who works zero point 0.8 EFT or more with 2 consecutive days off per week. And then it goes on to say that nothing in this subclause E is intended to restrict an employee requesting a single day off, including as a self-rostering request, or prevent an employee who works zero point 0.8 EFT or more from having a single day off rostered where they are also have consecutive days off rostered that week.
All right. So to state the obvious, there's not much point in having a roster without daily ordinary working hours and start and finish times. Meal intervals might be a surprise for some people.
Yeah, that's a long-standing requirement of the roster provision, but there's a note that we'll come to in a moment that gives that a little bit more context.
All right. The other elements go to compliance with the Safe Patient Care Act, the need for an in charge. Subclause D goes to not changing the roster, but it is subject to subclause 8.
That raises an interesting point about the purpose of the roster, which is to provide certainty to the extent that is possible to be certain.
And what does subclause 45.8 do?
It imposes a price on changing a roster within certain timeframes, which we will come to, except for emergencies external to the employer.
That does raise the obvious question: what is an emergency
Mhm.
external to the employer?
Yes. So, what it isn't is someone calling in sick and needing to fill a gap in the roster. It's more in the nature of an external event like major accidents and the like. So, train crashes, anything significant like that.
All right. The fifth element of subclause 2 goes to rostering of consecutive days off for some employees.
It applies to those who are full time or zero point 0.8 or above. Save that for those who are zero point 0.8, they might have a third single day off separate to the consecutive days.
And it's worth noting that element is new. The subclause does also conclude with a note, Tim.
It does, and you'll see that on screen. And it just refers you to another subclause for more information on the requirement for employee to have a system that records meal breaks.
So it really goes to the issue of actively managing meal breaks to ensure that claims of non-compliance don't arise. Tim, with regards to subclause 3, is subclause 3 new?
It is, and we'll bring up the first part of it now, as you can see on screen. So 45.3 talks about rosters not posted at least 28 days before it comes into operation. So from the 8th of July 2024, where a roster is not posted 28 days in advance as required by a subclause, each shift in the roster which is worked with less than 28 days notice shall attract a change of roster allowance as prescribed at subclause 45.8, Roman numeral 2. And it gives an example, and the example reads, roster for award was posted 25 days before coming into effect rather than 28 days as required by subclause. A change of roster is payable for those shifts worked on the roster with less than 28 days notice.
What's interesting about that is that it's a price for non-compliance with the rostering clause.
That's right. There's no cost if the existing requirements for posting the rosters are met, and they've been around for some time.
They have, and we are keen to draw attention to this new obligation so that members can avoid a circumstance where they incur a liability without realising it.
Yes. And as we've previously emphasised, it's essential that members satisfy themselves that these requirements are being met.
And with respect to this new subclause 3, there are some exceptions contained within the clause.
Yeah, so these are at 45.3b, and they read as follows. The provisions of subclause A do not apply where, Roman numeral 1, in respect of a shift that the employee agrees to work as an additional shift under the supplementary roster, in respect of a shift that the employee works that already attracts the change of roster allowance, Roman numeral 3, the shift was not rostered in advance because the employee swapped shifts by agreement with another employee. Or finally, the roster is varied in accordance with this agreement. For example, there's several subclauses that do that, as you can see.
So, Tim, let's move from a new clause, subclause 3, to one that hasn't changed, which is subclause 4 and breaks between rostered shifts.
Yes, that remains the same, and you can see it on the screen. It talks about breaks between rostered shifts, and what that says is the roster or rosters will be drawn up so as to provide at least 8 hours between successive ordinary shifts.
And there are some minor amendments to the fixed roster provisions.
There are. We'll bring the first part of the term up now. You can see that on screen, and that relates to fixed rosters. An employee, by making a written request to the employer, may have a roster fixed by mutual agreement, subject to the other provisions of this agreement, in lieu of the provisions of several subclauses, save that an employer will not unreasonably refuse a request for a fixed roster agreement where the employee can demonstrate a regular and systematic pattern of work. The subclause defines what a regular and systematic pattern of work means, and that is working set days or shifts in a demonstrable pattern over the preceding 6 months, recognizing that additional ordinary shifts may be worked around that fixed pattern, but does not include shifts worked because the employee who usually works them is on extended leave.
So that's a provision that provides a right to request a fixed roster in writing, but requires mutual agreement.
Save that the employer won't unreasonably refuse the request where there's a regular and systematic pattern of work, excluding shifts work because someone else is on extended leave. The subclause continues, as you can see on screen there, to say where a fixed roster agreement is made, the employer will provide the employee with an amended letter of appointment detailing the fixed roster agreement, which will be consistent with the regular and systematic pattern of work described at A and B above. And secondly, where the employer proposes to change the employee's fixed roster agreement, the terms of the clauses on screen there, consultation, or alternatively, the consultation without changes to rosters or hours of work will apply depending on the circumstances.
So fixed roster agreements are in writing with an amended letter of appointment consistent with the regular and systematic pattern of work. It's quite similar, Tim, to the approach to casual conversion, where someone requests to move from casual to part or full time employment.
Yes, but the clause also makes the point that what is fixed can be unfixed if necessary
Mm.
through the appropriate consultation mechanisms.
That's an interesting point. Subclause B goes to the timing of the request. It can occur at the point a change is proposed or has recently occurred.
Yeah, it can, and that request is then considered and won't be unreasonably refused. It's on screen now, and it reads: written requests for a fixed roster may be made in circumstances where the employer is proposing it to alter or has recently altered the employee's regular and systematic pattern of work.
So the balance of the term goes to the right of an employee to give notice and to end a fixed roster agreement. The rosters clause also goes to issues such as replacing people on the roster as a result of an unplanned absence.
It does. Subclause 6 requires the employer make a reasonable effort to replace an unplanned absence with a permanent employee working no less than the same shift length as he was originally rostered.
And when might that not be possible?
When late notice of the unexpected absence is provided is probably the most common example of that.
Mm. And the obvious question is, what's a reasonable effort?
So that's detailed in 45.6a Roman numeral 2, as you can see on the screen there, where that subclause says a reasonable effort means contacting nurses, midwives who are available, including in accordance with the supplementary roster. If the shift is not filled, reasonable attempts to ask nurses or midwives on that ward unit to fill the vacancy, except where it would result in overtime. And finally, if the shift is not filled, seeking to allocate a pool employee.
What's interesting about that for me is that those reasonable efforts need to be balanced against the right to disconnect provisions that are in the agreement and are the subject of another podcast, and the need to ensure that such contact is as efficient as possible.
It should be noted that the employer is also obliged to document its attempts to replace the vacancy, and that record is to be
Mm.
available for inspection by the union upon request.
Tim, in the context of replacing an unplanned absence, what about bank or agency staff?
Yeah, so the subclause 45.6b goes to that issue, and that provides as follows: where after a reasonable effort the employer cannot obtain a permanent employee, the rostered shift can only be replaced by anything other than the full shift length in accordance with the subclause, avoidance and management of short shifts.
So, Tim, just in terms of rosters and the role that they play, it's not just ordinary hours that are subject to a roster. On call is also something that's rostered.
Yes, subclause 45.7 provides for on-call rosters. The clause excludes casual employees, dons, or deputy dons as well.
Something of a theme there.
Yeah.
And the reason for rostering on call.
To create as much predictability as possible, now the term provides for planned on-call arrangements to be documented, and they mean the on-call arrangements the employee would reasonably expect to be required within the work location at the time the on-call roster is released. And planned on-call arrangements for full-time and part-time employees will be worked according to a written roster of at least 28 days duration and posted at least 28 days before it comes into operation in each location, where it can be readily seen by employees and representatives of the employees, including the union, without notice.
So that is replicating the general rostering provisions.
Yes, but also should be noted that B, as you can see on the screen, and C, B reads that nothing in this clause prevents an employer replacing an employee on call in circumstances where the requirement for the employee to be rostered on call was not known at the time the roster was released, save that where this occurs, the allowance is applies. And
Mm.
secondly, at C, on call recall payments are located, and they just give you an outline of where that subclause is.
Tim, we talked before about the price, that there is a price attached to failing to post a roster as required by the clause. But there's also a price for changing a roster without a certain amount of notice.
Yes, but this is not a new requirement, and it's located at subclause 8, which is entitled Change of Roster Allowance. If the employer changes an employee's roster or planned on call roster once set out in accordance with the subclause, other than as expected in subclause A, the change of roster allowance will apply in relation to each change as follows. So, 7 days or less notice, there's a rate of 5%. 8 to 14 days, there's an applicable rate of 2.5%. And finally, this allowance is not payable to a part-time employee for an additional shift worked unless the circumstances described in the supplementary roster and additional shifts subclause applies.
That's quite suspenseful in terms of that last part. But the key point, the key takeaway there is that there are different prices
Yes.
depending on the amount of notice and an exception with respect to part time employees working additional shifts. But that exception is subject to clause 46.2.
Yes, without meaning to drop a massive spoiler, subclause 46 concerns the supplementary roster, and subclause 4 covers the supplementary roster and additional shifts. There's more details at subclause B about that, which reads: if an additional shift is worked by a part-time employee other than under the supplementary roster, it attracts a change of roster allowance as described in the subclause above.
Which presents a challenge in terms of incentivizing participation in the supplementary roster when there's potentially an incentive for not doing so.
Yeah, the term concludes with a clarification as to the interaction with change of ward at 41A as well.
And there's also a new term at subclause 9, which is quite substantial.
Yeah, it is. It concerns rosters that include work on public holidays.
And the most obvious question with regards to the introduction of such a large additional subclause is why.
So some of us will remember this case. So it's a result of a decision about the operation of the National Employment Standards of the Fair Work Act. The is described in detail in Bulletin 2903, and that clause begins as follows: rosters within include, rosters which include work on public holidays. So, A, employers must implement a policy or procedure for the issuance and finalisation of rosters which cover the performance of work on a public holiday under the Act. The policy procedure referenced to subclause A above should, one, set out the process for an employee to request not to work on a public holiday they are requested to work, and two, set out the process for the employer to provide a written response to an employee's request not to work on a public holiday they are requested to work.
Yes, that bulletin number again is 2903. Really recommend that people get their head across that. But Tim, just in terms of that part that you've just gone to, what does happen if an employee receives a request, a refusal to work a public holiday?
So they must accept it unless the refusal is not reasonable in the circumstances, and the agreement contains indicators as to when a request is not reasonable.
If I was to speak broadly, I would say that those indicators are, which are derived from that decision, are sympathetic to our sector as such. In terms of subclause 10, we did refer to that earlier on, but that's a new provision.
And now we've arrived. It concerns those who aren't required to work a roster.
So why is this clause necessary?
There have always been some nurses and midwives who don't work a roster. Not a lot, but some. Because the agreement imposes a price on not posting a roster, it's necessary to exclude those who never have a roster.
Hmm.
So the term is on screen at the moment. It's entitled "Employees not required to have a roster." So the requirement to have a roster at the subclause and payments for failing to post a roster do not apply to those employees who are generally not required to work in accordance with the roster. Whether an employee is genuinely not required to work in accordance with the roster shall be determined on the circumstances, including the nature of the role and the environment in which it operates, the practice at the work site, and or that the employee's work hours are set or self-directed.
Tim, what about rostering and on-call?
Yeah, so that clause does not limit employees' obligations in respect to on-call rosters.
Okay. But rather than leaving it there, the agreement actually provides for an action to undertake to ensure there's no misunderstanding as to which roles are not required to work in accordance with the roster.
Yeah, it does that at subclause at C. By not later than the 1st of November 2024, the employer will provide the WIC with a list of existing employee positions it says do not work in accordance with the roster. Any disputes about whether such employees are generally not required to work in accordance with the roster for the purpose of subclause A above that are not resolved at the WIC will be referred to the Central Implementation Committee.
And members should refer to Bulletin 3062, which we issued as a reminder to undertake that task, and it also outlines the various pathways by which that information can be communicated.
Yeah, it does.
And finally, Tim, subclause D.
Yes. So D says that where the employer is proposing to create a position for which that subclause would apply, this information will be included in the change impact statement required in accordance with the agreement. You'll notify people that you're adding to that list that you provided through the change impact statement.
Again, it's really a mitigation strategy to avoid having a circumstance where that becomes a dispute later. You declare it up front. Tim, thank you so much for taking us through the amended Clause 45 rosters under the new Nurses and Midwives Agreement on this episode 300.
Thanks, Stuart. Now, I do think I've under-celebrated it.
I do think you have, as such, and for that, you're not getting any cake. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Stuart.
Unpacking.